He already knows. Before the ball leaves his boot, before it sails over the crossbar and disappears into that California sky, he already knows. You can see it in his shoulders, the way they drop, not in defeat, but in something far worse. Acceptance. There's a particular kind of pain that exists only in football. It doesn't come from losing. Losing you can process. Losing has reasons, tactics, fatigue, the other team was better. This is different. This is one moment, 1 second, one human being standing completely alone in the most watched sporting event on earth, and the whole world watching that human break. 94,000 in attendance, 32 billion watching at home, and in the middle of all of that, one man, one ball, one shot at immortality. And it was gone. But Baggio wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. These are the moments that still hurt, the ones that carved themselves into the memory of an entire sport, the ones players still think about at 3 a.m., decades later, when the house is quiet and there's nothing left to distract them. This is football's most painful World Cup moments. The divine ponytail's darkest night. Roberto Baggio, Italy versus Brazil, 1994 World Cup Final, Pasadena. To understand how devastating this was, you have to understand who Roberto Baggio was to Italy in the summer of 1994. He wasn't just a footballer. He was a religion. When Italy had been on the verge of elimination in the group stage, it was Baggio who rescued them. 2 minutes left against Ireland. He scored. Italy survived. Against Nigeria in the round of 16, Italy were losing with 2 minutes to play. Baggio. Against Spain, Baggio. Against Bulgaria in the semis, Baggio. Baggio. He had dragged this entire team to a World Cup final on his back, single-handedly, almost literally. This wasn't a team tournament for Italy, it was a one-man pilgrimage, and Roberto Baggio was carrying every single Italian with him. Italian fans were weeping in the streets, kissing photos of him, praying. That's not an exaggeration, that's just what was happening. The final itself was a brutal, exhausting, goalless war. 90 minutes, then 120. Nothing. And so it came down to penalties. The shootout was almost cinematic in how cruel it was. Baresi, Italy's captain and defensive god, missed his. Massaro missed. Then Baggio stepped up, with the score tied. He had to score, not just to keep Italy alive, but because the whole narrative demanded it. Of course, the man who'd saved Italy 5 times was going to save them one more time. He ran up. He struck it. And the ball flew, high, wide, and into the net behind the goal. Baggio, standing alone, head bowed, hands on hips. The Brazilian players erupting behind him. He doesn't turn around. He can't. He said later, "That penalty will follow me for the rest of my life." And it has. In every interview, every documentary, every time his name is mentioned, the sentence ends the same way. The man who saved Italy couldn't save himself. The beautiful game's ugliest second. Zinedine Zidane, France versus Italy, 2006 World Cup Final, Berlin. There are players who transcend sport. Zidane was one of them. By 2006, he'd already retired. He'd walked away from international football. And then France, broken, disorganized, desperate, called him back. And because it was Zidane, because it was always Zidane, he came back. And he was magnificent. He scored a cheeky, impudent Panenka penalty in the final, his 9th goal of the tournament, at 34 years old. The best player in the world, one last time, on the grandest stage. France were 1-0 up. This was supposed to be the fairy tale ending. Zidane, World Cup, sunset, credits roll. Then came the 110th minute. Nobody heard what Materazzi said. The world has speculated for nearly 20 years. Zidane later confirmed it involved his sister, and something in him, something ancient and proud and ferociously human, snapped. He stopped walking. He turned around. And in front of billions of people watching around the world, Zinedine Zidane buried his head into Marco Materazzi's chest with every ounce of force he had. The referee reached into his pocket. Red card. Zidane's face, not angry anymore, just resigned. He walked past the World Cup trophy on his way off the pitch. Didn't look at it. Couldn't. France lost the shootout. And the greatest footballer of his generation, a man who had given everything, who had come back for this, who had been the best player in that final, left his last ever professional football match 10 minutes early, sent off, head bowed, in disgrace. The image of him walking past that trophy is one of the most haunting in the history of the sport. He had been 10 minutes from perfection. 10 minutes. The night football itself broke. Brazil versus Germany, 2014 World Cup semi-final, Belo Horizonte. Some football matches end. This one collapsed. Brazil in 2014 weren't just the host nation. They were carrying a wound that had festered for 64 years. The Maracanazo, the 1950 final defeat at home, the national trauma that had been passed down through generations like a bad inheritance. This was the tournament to fix all of that. And then Neymar broke his vertebra in the quarterfinal. And Thiago Silva got suspended. And Brazil, threadbare, emotional, already cracking, walked out against Germany in a semi-final, in front of their own people, under pressure that no football team should ever have to carry. Thomas Müller, 11 minutes, 1-0. What followed in the next 24 minutes was not a football match. It was a public execution. Müller again. Closer. Kroos again in 69 seconds. Khedira, 5-0. 17 minutes played in the second half. In the stands, Brazilian fans were weeping, not the polite tears of disappointment, heaving, inconsolable, bewildered sobs. Some of them had looks on their faces like they couldn't process what they were watching, like the world had stopped making sense. One young Brazilian boy, maybe 12 years old, face painted yellow and green, tears running so fast he wasn't even trying to wipe them anymore. That image traveled around the world in hours because it said everything. It ended 7-1. 7-1. Brazil, at home, at a World Cup they'd waited 64 years to win, destroyed so completely, so publicly, so mercilessly, that the word for it entered the Portuguese language, O Mineração, the Mineiro disaster. The Brazilian players stood on the pitch at full time like men who'd been in a car crash and were still figuring out what had happened. David Luiz, who had played every minute of that tournament, was on his knees, crying so hard his whole body shook. Some losses are about football. That one was about something else entirely. Identity, pride, the fragile, essential lie that football tells a nation about itself. Brazil believed that lie completely. Germany took it apart in 24 minutes. The ghost of a red card. Luis Suarez, Uruguay versus Ghana, 2010 World Cup quarterfinal, Johannesburg. This one is complicated because the heartbreak belongs to someone else. It's the last minute of extra time, Ghana versus Uruguay. The winner goes to the semi-final and becomes the first African nation ever to reach the last four of a World Cup. The whole continent is watching. The whole world is leaning forward. Then Dominic Adia's header flies toward an open goal, and Luis Suarez punches it off the line. Deliberately, knowingly, looked straight at it and used his hand. Red card. Penalty awarded. Asamoah Gyan stepping up. Suarez was off the pitch by now, and he was celebrating, jumping, fist-pumping in the tunnel. Gyan had scored every penalty he'd ever taken. The crowd was deafening. Ghana were seconds from history. He struck it off the bar. Silence. He sank to his knees immediately, not slowly, like his legs had been cut from under him. His teammates rushed to him, held him. He was inconsolable. Uruguay won on penalties. The Ghanaian bench, grown men, professional footballers, were covering their faces, some of them sitting on the floor. Suarez called it the save of the tournament. A whole continent will never forgive him. Ghana went home, Uruguay went to the semi-final, and Asamoah Gyan, a brilliant, brave footballer who did absolutely nothing wrong, carried that crossbar with him for years. He had the words, "God is great," tattooed on his wrist. On that night in Johannesburg, it felt like God was looking somewhere else. The boy who carried a country. Andrés Escobar, Colombia, 1994 World Cup. And then there is this, the story that reminds you that for all the drama, the penalties, the tactical failures and heartbreaks, sometimes football intersects with something so much darker and so much more real that the sport itself feels almost irrelevant. Colombia in 1994 arrived as one of the favorites. Pelé had predicted they'd win the whole thing. A brilliant generation, Valderrama, Asprilla, and Andrés Escobar, 27 years old, the clean-cut, elegant center-back who captained the team with quiet dignity. Against the United States in the group stage, in one of the tournament's defining moments of cruel irony, Escobar turned a cross into his own net. Colombia went out. 10 days later, back in Medellin, Andrés Escobar was shot dead outside a restaurant. 12 bullets. His killer allegedly shouted "Gol" after each one. He was 27. Football, real football, the kind that runs in the blood of a nation where betting cartels controlled the game and death was the consequence of failure. This is where this story lives. We talk about pressure in football, about how much it costs a player to miss a penalty or make an error on the biggest stage. Andrés Escobar paid a price that none of us should ever have to imagine. He was buried on July 4th, 1994. Over 100,000 people lined the streets of Medellin to say goodbye to him. They weren't just mourning a footballer. They were mourning something that football can be at its purest, joyful, dignified, and free. The own goal didn't cost Colombia the game. Bad defending, bad luck, a difficult tournament, these things happen. But in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in a world where football and violence had become hideously tangled, it cost Andrés Escobar everything. Some World Cup pain is about a match. Some is about a moment. And then there is Escobar, the reminder that behind every name on a team sheet is a human being, a son, a brother, a friend, and that sometimes the weight football places on those human beings is heavier than any of us fully comprehend. Here's what I keep coming back to. We don't watch football because it's safe. We don't give it this space in our hearts because it always rewards us. We watch it because it's real. Because the men on that pitch feel everything. The hope, the terror, the impossible weight of a nation's dreams sitting on their shoulders. And they carry it anyway. Baggio missed that penalty. Zidane lost his mind for 1 second. Brazil fell apart in front of the world. Gyan hit the bar at the worst possible moment. And Escobar paid a price no human being should ever pay for a football match. But every single one of them played. They stepped into the arena, they carried the weight, and they gave everything they had. That's why we love this sport. Not because it's fair, not because it rewards the deserving, but because when it breaks you, and God, it will break you, it does it in a way that makes you feel completely, devastatingly, beautifully human. The pain is the proof that it mattered. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these moments broke your heart the most? Or is there one I didn't mention that still keeps you up at night? That one image, that 1 second, that one name that your brain won't let go of?
Drop it in the comments. Tell me the story. Because the best conversations about football happen when we stop pretending it's just a game and admit how deep it actually goes. And if you want more dives like this into the soul of football, into the real stories beneath the headlines, hit subscribe. There's a lot more pain and a lot more beauty where this came from.